I'm Paula Storm. Thanks for joining me today on my YouTube channel. Alright, here we go on our next row of the slow and steady quilt along. Now today I've decided we're going to go ahead and do the clamshells. Now this is actually the last row of the quilt, but I've decided to change it up a little bit. Most of you decided you wanted an easier row for a change. So we're going to do this one this week, and then we're going to go back and do some more foundation paper piecing next week. Okay, so to start off with, we need to cut out our clamshells. Now, this is the template. If you've decided that you would like to do these by hand, then you'll need to cut out these shapes by hand. We need a total of 77 clamshells to complete this portion of the quilt. If you'd like to use the AccuQuilt Go or the AccuQuilt cutter, you're also going to need 77, but it's just going to take you a lot less time. So I just thought I'd quickly start off by showing you the AccuQuilt. So I've got the AccuQuilt Go, which is like the medium size cutter, and I'm using the 4-inch clamshell die. So let's just take one piece of fabric to start with and lay it on top. Now the first thing to take notice of is the die actually has a label on one side. So the rest of them are just plain green. And on this side we have the sticker on here. When you're cutting with the dies, you want that to be facing you. So that's just an easy way of making sure you've got it right. And then we're going to lay the fabric on top. Now I am using just little bits of scrap that I've had left over from my my quilt. But what you want to do is make sure that when you lay the fabric on top that you want the grain going in the right way. So I always try and keep my self edges attached to my fabric so I know which way the grain is. So I'm just going to lay that on top. I usually just peel it back and make sure that everything's going to fit. Now if I cut it like that, I'd be very close to my self edge. So I'm actually just going to pull it a little bit closer to me, and then I'll make sure that I'm going to cut the whole piece around the top there. So that looks good to me. The next thing we need to do is pop a cutting mat on top, because you need a cutting mat for these cutters. And you just want to lay it on top and make sure it covers the whole die, or the whole piece that you're cutting out with your die. So then all we have to do is push it up close to the roller here, to the blade. Or sorry, this is the roller. There's a blade in the die, so there's no cutter in here. We're just going to roll through. And so just use the hand crank to pull that through. Now I'm only cutting one layer of fabric at the moment, and this is really good if you're fussy cutting. You can cut just one layer of fabric at a time, or you can cut up to, I think it's 6 or 7 layers with nothing on the back. So if you've got no visor fix or anything on the back, then you can cut through, I think, 7 layers. Okay, so that's our first cut, and now you'll notice if I peel back that excess, I'm left with a perfect clamshell shape. So that's all we need to do. We need to cut out a heap of those, and you want a total, as I said, of 77 of these clamshell shapes cut out to finish our row. If you are, of course, cutting out by hand, again, you can take your template here that you can print out from the blog, from the Slow and Steady Quilt Along blog, and you'll need to cut out the outside shape. So you want the very outside to cut out your pieces. You want them to fit exactly that shape. Okay, so that's the first job, is to do your cutting out. The second job is to start putting these together. Now I've got a few different ways of putting these together. So we're going to start with the machine piecing technique, and then we're going to switch over to a hand piecing technique. So let's get started with the machine technique. Okay, so this is what we're going for here. We're going for 5 rows of clamshells all together to make our finished piece. Now to start with, we need a row of half clamshells, but we're not actually going to cut the top off yet. I actually like to start with full clamshells. I just find it's easier to piece, and then we can trim it up later. So let's get started. We've got all of our clamshells laid out here. This is just a small sample, but as I said, to start with our first row, we need a row of 15. Okay, that's on the pattern, so have a look at your pattern piece if you get a bit lost. Then we're going to add a second row, one at a time. So as we're piecing, we're going to do our first row first, then we'll come back in and start adding more clamshells along the way. I find when I'm machine piecing, this is much easier than doing rows and then joining the rows together. I find it's a bit trickier to get it to lay out neatly. So let's get started with our first row. Now my trick to this is, because we've got curves here, this is the biggest trick with clamshells. We've got lots of curve piecing. And if you were to just join, so put these right sides together and start joining in a curve shape like normal, it won't lay flat when you come to press them apart. My little trick is to actually sew a straight line. So I'm going to put them straight, right sides together. And if you want to, you can grab a ruler. Your outer quarter would be good here because it's got a 1/4 inch for you already. And what you can do is line up your outer quarter ruler along the side there. Can you see how I've got a 1/4 inch at the very bottom, and then it just sort of tapers off towards the top? So what I like to do is I like to sew a straight line through there, because then when I open it up, I get a flat piece to work with in the second row. So see how that would work there? So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to join 15 pieces into one long row, and then we can start on our second row. So there we go. We've got our finished seam, which ends at a 1/4 inch down here, but it starts sort of at nothing. But it means we've got a straight line so that when we open these up, we've got a nice straight piece to work with. Okay, so there we go. That's the first section. Now, as I said, you do need to start with 15. I'm just doing a small portion to show you the technique, but you want to have a whole row of 15 clamshells before you move on to the next step. Okay, so I've sewn all my strips together in a nice straight line so that when I fold them out, then it's nice and straight. I can use that line on my ironing board to make sure that it's a nice straight row. Now, I haven't pressed any of these seams yet, so what I like to do is actually press them open. This is one of the very rare cases where I actually press my seams open, and I usually just use my Hera marker. That's this little tool here, a little Hera marker, or any pressing tool. You can even just use your fingernails for that matter, but I had it close to hand, so this is what I'm going to use. And I just finger press them or press them open. You can then grab your iron and give them a good press if you like. Actually, I might do that. Okay, so we'll give them a press so that those seam allowances are nice and flat. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the next stage. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky, but honestly, stick with me and you'll find it goes together really neatly. So we're going to need some pins, and honestly, once you get started, you'll find that you'll probably sew these freehand. But to start with, I'd like you to try with the pins first. So what we can do is we can take our next piece of fabric, and you can choose any colour. I like to mix up my colours. This one's just with my leftover pieces, so it's not a great colour variation. But the other thing I like to do is I like to cut at least twice the amount of your background colour as you have of each coloured fabric. So what I mean by that is, at the start I cut 2 of each fabric into clamshells that I had, and then I cut 4 of my background fabric, and it just intersperses the grey into, or the background fabric that you're using, into your piece a bit more evenly. And I really like that, having a little bit of solid or a little bit of a different colour, a darker colour, spread throughout these clamshells. So that's what I did. But in this case, I'm just going to use what I have left over. Okay, now first of all, we need to have 1 clamshell on the outside. So let me straighten that up so you can see. I like to have 1 clamshell, or we need to have 1 clamshell on the outside. In the end, we're actually going to trim half of that off, but we need it there to start with to get that straight row in the end. And then what I'll do is I'll come in and I'll add more clamshells all along the line here. So our first row, we need 15. Our second row, we actually need 16 clamshells. So you need 2 halves on either end of the piece. So to do this, we're going to use our little points here as a guide. I'm not sure you can see there. See, there's a little point here in the center. There's a little point on the outside edge, and there's also 2 points down in the corners here. Now, these are really, really useful, and they're what you're going to use to line up the whole piece. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to line up that center point with our edge here. So what I like to do is, to save myself getting confused, I like to lay out the whole piece on my cutting mat or my ironing board, and then I take my next piece and I flip it upside down. So we have them right sides together. So we start like this. That's how I want this piece to be joined into here. So I'm going to flip it upside down and line up that center point there. Now if this was in the middle, I would be able to pin it. But because it's on the edge, I'm not going to be able to pin it, but I still do this to make sure I'm in the right order. Then what I do is I'll grab the corner here and I'll pivot it round until these 2 points meet here, because this is the most important piece here on this edge. And then what I'll do is I'll take a pin and I'll pop a pin in there. So that's our first part. Now I can spin this back a little bit, and everything's going to lift up and it's going to shift and it's going to feel a bit messy. It's okay. We just want to get 3 pins in to start with so we know where we're going. So I'm going to pin through that top edge, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this one down and I'm going to pin it right at the bottom. Now you'll find that this is going to curve up and it's going to feel really awkward. I find that what I like to do is have this big piece with the outer curve on the bed of the sewing machine. So I actually want to flip it upside down, because this piece is the one that's going to curve on me. It's going to give me the easiest way of getting it to curve. So I like to have that on top. I'm not sure if you can see there, but I like to spin it around until the bottom edge of the clamshell lines up with the bottom edge of the yellow clamshell. And I'm just going to pop another pin in here. And look, to start with, this is really awkward, but it does get easier, I promise. Okay, so we've got that pinned there. So I don't know if you can see, but we've got the yellow clamshell underneath, and we're going to be joining this, which is our top row. We're going to be joining it to our yellow clamshell. So we're going to flip the whole top row upside down so that we can sew this seam. Now what you can do is throw a heap of pins in here. The more pins you have, the easier it is to sew curves. Okay, so there we go. We have lots of pins. We've got our 2 clamshells right sides together, and we've got our first row, which is just all bunched up at the side here. So we're going to just bunch that up, and we're going to stitch this half a seam first of all using our 1/4 inch seam. Now once again, move your needle over so that you can just run the fabric around the outside of the foot. So I'm just going to drop my foot and drop my needle. Now in this case I am going to reverse, so I'm just going to start sewing a few stitches and then I'm going to back up. Now normally we don't need to do that, but for this case, because there's going to be pressure on that seam, I'm going to reverse. Okay, now I'm using my fingers here to just pull those gathers in, because I want this seam to be as straight as possible as I'm stitching. So I'm just going to stitch very slowly, take out the pins as I get to them, like that. If you want to, you can have your needle down so that the foot lifts up a little bit. That's a feature of the Husqvarnas that I absolutely love and I use all the time. So we're going to start stitching. Now see how I've got a little lump here? What I like to do is just give it a tug and see how by giving it a pull, see how it's flattened out? I don't know if you can see there. If I give it a little tug as I get to it, it will just flatten out and I'll be able to sew a perfect smooth curve. Okay, keep taking out those pins as you get to them and make sure that those points line up when you get to them. Okay, I've got another little lump happening here. Again, if I just give that a little tug, see how if I pull it backwards, it's going to get rid of that crease altogether. So I'll just pull it back and keep stitching. Making sure my fabric's lined up out the edge here. I've got another crease here. I'm just going to give it a pull backwards. And when I get to the end, okay, so we're back over from the machine and we've got that seam sewn 1/4 inch from the outside all the way around, and that's it. That's all we have to do for that first one. And there we go, that's our first piece. So that's probably the trickiest one. Getting that first one is quite tricky. The rest of them go together really quite easily. So let's grab another piece. So we've got our next one to go in here. And honestly, it doesn't look like it's going to fit. It really doesn't. It looks way too big to be able to fit in here. But if you just take your time, give it a good, and pop all your pins in, then you'll find it really goes together quite easily. So next up is to add another one in here. So what I need to do is I need to take my fabric, I've got it right sides up, I'm going to flip it over and put it right sides down. Now you'll notice the little point here, it needs to be hanging over into this no man's land. So you want that to line up with the seam allowance you've got in the very center here, you want that to line up, but you want it sticking out a little bit because you want a 1/4 inch from this edge, not from the outside of the point. And then once again, we're going to start popping some pins in. So I line up my center first, and then we can spin it around and line up these 2 points with these 2 points here. Now once again, I like to flip it over because these top edges, the inside curve, are going to curve much easier to line up with those points. Now once again, it does feel quite awkward, but just pop the pins in those points and everything will line up in the end. Okay, so I've got my first pin in. I'm going to spin this one around and pop it in here. So far I've got 3 pins in. Then I want to do my ends, so they're going to pin around the bottom of the curve. This is really quite tricky to show on camera. It looks a lot more awkward than it actually is. So trust me, just give it a go, and you'll find it's really the quickest way to do these clamshells is to do them by machine. It's much easier to do them by hand, so if you want to do them by hand, that's another option, but it is much quicker to do them by machine. Okay, so there's our next one all pinned. Well, we've got our 5 basic pins, the base pins, I like to call them the base pins. So you've got 1 in each corner, then you've got 2 in your points, and you've got 1 in the center. You can then come in and put more pins in here and here and here and here, and that'll get it to lay much flatter for you. And I'll show you the back. So that's our back. It's nice and flat. We've got our pins in the bottom corners, we've got our pins at the points here, and we've got a pin in the center. So you always want to stitch this with this shape. The one that's the flattest, the one that's the most even, needs to be facing down. We want to sew from this top edge where everything's all wrinkled up, because if you don't, you'll end up with little points and folds and tucks and things, and it can look quite messy. So you always sew from this side, not this side here. Okay, so I've got my second piece sewn, so I'm just going to fold that back so I can show you. And see how that one fit in just beautifully there? It's a bit wrinkled at the moment. So there you go, that's our first 2 on our second row. Now you need to continue all the way along, going one at a time. So the next piece I would take is this middle one here. So once again, I'd lay it out on my mat first to make sure I've got it in the right order, flip it over, pin that middle one, then spin it around, pin that side, spin it around and pin that side. So I'd pin it all the way around like that and then stitch it into place like so. So that's the machine way. So that's the easiest way to join these by machine. As I said, it's a much trickier if you join all your rows and then join your rows together. I find it much trickier that way. So I like to do them one at a time. So that's the way I do this one. If you wanted a simpler, much simpler way of doing this, then I'm going to take you through my hand technique. Now you can still sew these by machine at the end, but we're just preparing them by hand. So I'm going to take you through that process. So let's get them out of the way. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to take a couple of pieces of freezer paper. You'll find that I use freezer paper by the truckload, so it's worth getting yourself a roll if you can. Now I've just got 2 pieces. Now they just need to be big enough to cut out the inside edge of the template that I've given you this week. So make sure it's big enough for that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them together and iron them together so they stick to each other to give us a nice solid template. So the way you do that is you take your first piece, and as you'll know from last week, it's got a shiny side. That's the side that sticks to the fabric, and it's got your paper side. So you want to put the shiny side facing down, and then you want to take another piece again with the shiny side facing down, and we want to iron those 2 together. And it just gives you a little bit more body to make this much easier to do. So as we did last week, we're just going to give it a good iron so it sticks to the ironing board, because as well as sticking to itself, what this does, it also pre-shrinks the paper. So if you don't iron it first, it can shrink up a little bit. Okay, so we're giving that a good iron. Make sure it sticks to the ironing board to pick up those little bits of lint, and then we're ready to go. Okay, so we're going to go back to our template, and now this time it says in the center to paper piece cut out templates from the inside line. So that's the one that we're going to use, the white inside line. Now the most important part about this this clamshell shape is this outside edge. So you don't have to worry too much about these inside pieces, but we are very worried about this because that's the edge that's going to show. So we want to trace that out. It is fairly easy. It's not on camera, but it's fairly easy to see through, even through the 2 layers. But we just want to make sure you're nice and accurate, because whatever you trace out here, that's what you're going to end up with in the end. Okay, so there's our template. Now you'll notice that I've traced the outside line, which is exactly here, and then I've traced the bottom edge on my template as well as this inside edge, because we're only going to turn under this top edge. So you can actually leave this bottom edge nice and free, and I actually find it makes it easier to line up on the fabric. So you want to trace this edge perfectly. The bottom edge doesn't matter so much. So I'm just going to cut that out. Okay, so there we have our template. Now you'll notice that it fits beautifully on the inside line here, but it also lines up with the outside edge down the bottom. If you want to, you can cut it out, but you'll find that you'll have a little point here that's quite flimsy, and it's going to bend on you. So you can just cut out the bottom edge even with the outside. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric. Now I'll grab my ironing board again. Okay, so the next step is to prepare our pieces to then hand piece or machine piece. So I like to use my appliqué brush. So this is the Paula Storm Designs appliqué brush. Inside you get a little, it looks like a paintbrush, and it has a reservoir on it. So the reservoir you fill up with starch. Not glue, it's not glue, it's a starch. So you want to fill that up with starch, and the recipe for the starch comes in the tin as well. So you can make that up at home. You will never need to buy refills. You can just make it yourself. And the reason I like to make it myself is that I know how heavy it is, how stiff the starch is, and I like the handmade starch much better. Okay, so I've got my brush. I also like to use a little hair marker just so I don't burn my fingers. So they're the main tools that I'll use here. I'm going to take my template that we've made and I'm going to line it up. See how I'm lining it up? Because I cut that extra seam allowance down here, I can line it up with my clamshells that I've already cut out, and that gives me a perfect 1/4 inch around the outside edge here. So I'm just going to iron that on. And there we go. So I've got my freezer paper template stuck on my clamshell here. I wasn't very accurate with my cutting there. I need a bit of a lesson on cutting, but anyway, that's close enough, because as I said, this top edge is the only one that matters. So I'm going to take my applique brush, which is, as I said, full of starch, and I'm just going to give it a squeeze, and I'm going to paint the fabric only. I want to try not to get it on the paper, because if you get the paper wet, obviously it'll get a bit soggy. So I'm just painting around the outside of the fabric only, like that. And then I'm going to take my Hera marker, and I'm just going to pull that fabric over the template and hold it in place with my Hera marker. Then I'm going to go to the iron, and you can use your big iron for this. I normally use a little mini iron, but your big iron's just fine. And what I'm doing is just pulling the fabric over the template nice and solidly, or firmly I should say, because you want it to pull around the template so you get a really nice smooth edge. So I'm just going to give it an iron till it's dry. Then if you need to, move it around to give yourself a better grip on it. And I'm just going to keep ironing all the way around. Now if you use a regular store-bought starch, which you can, that's fine, but I find that it does tend to burn your ironing board. So see how my ironing board's a bit brown here? That's been caused by using store-bought starch. So if you use my recipe that comes in the applique brush, you won't get that burning, scorching on your ironing board. Okay, so that's our first one, and you can see that I've pressed my seam allowance all the way over, so I get a really nice smooth edge. So you want to do that to every single one of your templates or your clamshells, and then what you can do is you can just peel the fabric off your freezer paper template, because we can reuse this over and over and over again. So you'll probably get, you'll probably only need 3 or 4 templates for the whole quilt. Eventually they will start to curl up on you just from being wet and then ironed and wet and ironed. So it will curl up eventually, and you'll lose that crisp sharpness around the edge. So you'll need to make a couple of these, but you really only need a few of them. So once I've done that edge, you can see I can just lay that on top, and I'm done without all the machine stitching. So I really like doing these by hand. As I said, you can stitch them by machine. You can come back in and you can do a little machine stitch around the outside. You can use a decorative stitch if you like. See how nice and neat that edge is? And just by laying them on top, when you've got that prepared edge, you can just come in and lay out the entire piece if you like. That one, obviously I haven't turned the edge there, but you can see what it's going to look like. So you can do them by hand, by machine, which can be a bit tricky, or you can do them by hand, and then you can just lay out the entire piece. What I would then do is come in with some glue. Maybe you can use the Soline glue stick pen, or I like to use the Roxanne's glue based it. And all you need to do, we'll flip it over, you just dab a few dots of glue around the outside. You only need a tiny amount, less than a pinhead of glue, and just stick that around the outside of your piece. And then when we flip it over, you can line it up exactly where it needs to be. And I usually like to line up on the corners here. So I make sure I've got a 1/4 inch left for the next piece. So I'll line it up like that. Glue it into position. If you hit it with an iron, it'll actually dry that glue really quickly. So once you've got them all glued into position, you've got your whole piece laid out, you can then come in and you can just hand stitch this down if you're a hand stitcher. I usually just use a blind hemming stitch, so the same thing I would use to sew on a binding. Or you can go to your machine and you can use one of your nice decorative stitches and just stitch around the outside like so. So you can do your whole piece with glue like that before you've sewn a single stitch. So that's actually my preferred way, and if you would like to have a go, as I said, the applique brush is what I use. The recipe for the starch comes with the brush, so it's all inside this little box here. There's even a video to show you how I use this technique for all my needle turn applique as well, so you can watch that on YouTube as well. So that's how I like to do my hand stitched clamshells. You'll find that technique is much easier. So there we go, that's our clamshells. So I hope you find this technique really fun and I hope you give it a go. Next week we're going to go back to foundation paper piecing and we're going to do our flying geese blocks. So that'll be fun too. But keep sending through the pictures on the Facebook group. It's really fun to see all of your different fabric selections and the way you piece your quilts together. So we'll see you over on the Facebook group.